Welcome to the Extra Literary Affairs podcast. We provide fiction reviews for the lit, curious reader, because why not try a little of everything? Our scholarish approach and cozy book club atmosphere makes literature accessible to everyone. Whether you're a casual reader or a devoted bookworm, join us on our literary journey to explore all genres.
Hello, and welcome back to Extra Literary Affairs. I'm Jennifer, your host for this week's episode. And today, Joey, Chris, and I will be having an affair with Shirley Jackson and her short story, The Witch. In a recent Extra Literary Affairs episode, Joey and I discussed Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, which left us eager to dive a little bit deeper into another of Jackson's short stories. And so we invited Chris along to join us as we unravel some additional intricacies of her storytelling style and explore the dark undercurrents that make The Witch a truly disturbing read, at least for me. Others may have other opinions. Shirley Jackson is known as one of the most influential authors in the realm of Gothic literature, and she has once again left us spellbound and perhaps a little confused or disturbed with her story, The Witch, which was first published in 1949. This story weaves a captivating tale filled with suspense and psychological depth in a very, very short story. It fits on one single double-sided paper, so a very quick read. And before we go much further, I would like to do a little bit of background on Shirley Jackson. As I had mentioned, Joey and I did an extensive discussion of The Lottery a couple of weeks ago, and I think it deserves repeating some highlights from Shirley Jackson's life. So she was born in 1916 in San Francisco, California, and she is a very renowned American writer of horror and mystery, Gothic literature. She spent her early years in California, and then she moved to Rochester, New York as a teenager, where she actively began writing. Her passion emerged very early in her life, and she attended Syracuse University, where she met her future husband, the literary critic Stanley Edgar Hyman. I think we have recently talked about some other standouts from Syracuse University, so shout out to them for their amazing literary heritage. Her career really took off in the 40s with the publication of her first novel, which is The Road Through the Wall in 1948. However, as we discussed in a previous episode, it was her short story, The Lottery, which was published in The New Yorker in 1948, that catapulted her to fame and much controversy. And there's a lot of hubbub about that. So if you're curious to know more about The Lottery, check out our episode about that. The Lottery, I'll just say this really quickly, that story's shocking portrayal of human nature and societal conformity left a huge mark in American literature and has remained a staple of anthologies ever since. I think of all of the works that Shirley Jackson has put out there, the average person that I have bumped to, if I say, hey, have you ever heard of Shirley Jackson and The Lottery? The answer is yes. And throughout her career, she continued to explore themes of psychological horror and the supernatural. One of her acclaimed novels is The Haunting of Hill House from 1959. And Joey, I know that is a personal favorite of your own, and I believe it is now a Netflix series, so still very relevant to our cultural conversations. These works, including The Hangman from 1951 and We Have Always Lived in a Castle in 1962, which was her last novel, showcase her ability to delve into the darkest corners of the human psyche, blending everyday settings with very unsettling, often surreal elements. Unfortunately, despite her literary success, Jackson herself faced many personal challenges, including struggles with anxiety and various health issues. She passed away very prematurely in 1965 at the age of 48. However, Shirley's enduring legacy carries on as her works continue to captivate and influence readers and writers, affirming her place as a master of modern Gothic fiction. And so that was a lot, but she's so amazing. Before we go any further, let's just do a really quick recap of The Witch. So The Witch is a chilling short story that takes place on a train journey. The narrative follows a young boy named Johnny who is traveling with his mother and his sister. As the family sits in their train compartment, an older man enters and strikes up a conversation directly with Johnny. The seemingly innocent chatter quickly turns unsettling as the man shares a dark and very graphic tale about a witch who kills and eats children, and possibly what he himself perpetrated against his younger sister, but that remains to be seen. Johnny's mother, horrified by the man's story, attempts to shield her son from the gruesome details. This story captures the tension between childhood innocence and the intrusion of darker forces, showcasing Jackson's mastery in creating psychological horror and suspense. So, guys, The Witch, Shirley Jackson. Really looking forward to hearing what your impressions are, Joey and Chris. Joey, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. I was just trying to look up like what are the major events that were happening in 1949. I mean, there was a lot. There's a lot happening. The establishment of NATO, that's pretty cool. There was apartheid in South Africa. I think that's when it started. So not so great. NATO, yes. Apartheid, no. So I love this story, obviously. And side note, not for this podcast, but this is a story that broke up lit fiction. It is the straw that broke the camel's back. And for that reason, it's cursed and we must discuss it. I love Shirley Jackson and I really love the story. It is so short, but so effective. I mean, talk about economical writing. I'll talk more in depth of all the particular topics that I want to talk about, but I think this is a great example of how well Shirley Jackson can establish the status quo. Again, I think she does it as well as Edgar Allan Poe does, where they just give it to it right away. The very first sentence, we believe we understand where this is going to go. Or at least we understand there's this weird dichotomy between the title, The Witch, and this very mundane setting of a little family on a train. I mean, it unravels so quickly that it's genius. I'll leave it there for now.
Joey, thank you for that. And I am really curious to see what Chris's reaction was. And I would like to say welcome to Chris. This is your first appearance on the Extra Literary Affairs, and we are very happy to have you.
Thank you, Jennifer. So yeah, I just wanted to say that, again, this is my first foray into podcasting. So I have to express how new I am to this. And as a neophyte, some of my insight may not be so eloquent as yours. So I defer, obviously, to your experience. My first impression of this, and again, this is my first experience also with Shirley Jackson. So not so familiar with her work. On first reading, when you look at basically the surface value or the main impact, it's really just kind of a shocking content, a dialogue between this elderly man and basically a toddler. He's 4 years old. So there was that interesting just exchange. I also was struck, as same with basically what Joey was saying, I was struck with the economy of the writing here. I was just so impressed with how much was jammed into literally just 4 pages of content here. But what this did was it really kind of captivated me to delve deeper into it. What really draws my attention into any writing is if it forces me to think further and it compels me to think into deeper connections, deeper details, and search beyond just the surface meaning. One of the things that really struck me was basically the contrast between the stereotypical fantasy image of a witch versus what a possible real witch might look like. We have this image that's kind of ingrained into our heads, and we are left with this possibility that maybe this man is a witch and he looks absolutely ordinary. And does this raise questions of, okay, are there witches among us in real life? And can we recognize them? Or is it something that is really kind of hidden amongst ourselves versus something that sticks out so easily? So there's that contrast. There's also another contrast between the childhood grasp of fantasy versus reality. Clearly, this is a 4-year-old child, and at that point, you don't really get a sense of what time really means. And clearly he's saying, oh, I'm 26, but I'm also 840, 80. Well, okay, what is that? That's obviously a clearly fantastical time that doesn't exist. And yet his younger sister is 12 and a half, which obviously clearly doesn't make sense. And so there's a disconnect between that and also the fact that when someone is dead, they're dead. And he doesn't really grasp that in the middle of this conversation that he's having with this older gentleman.
Chris, I really appreciate you bringing out the idea that this is a fairy tale, because that was one of the things that was my initial impression of, yes, it is so short. And as Joey stated, oh, we're all on a train. This is just so easy to digest. Like, this is just going to be a really simple story. why is it called The Witch? Like, that didn't make any sense in the opening. And the creativity of the boy making up stories, trying to get his mom's attention. She's reading a book. And I think this was, very in keeping with Shirley Jackson's kind of dark sense of humor. That's what struck me about the story. In such a short amount of time, she can be like, okay, the mom's sort of ignoring her kid because she's trying to read a book, and the little boy is engaging in his imagination. And he meets this older gentleman who seems to really relish in these fantastical details, but it quickly takes a turn of like, you are not allowed to talk to small children about murder, dismemberment, and feeding your kid sister to a bear. Like, that is just an out of bounds conversation, whether in my mind in 1949 or in 2025, probably not the most age appropriate conversation. So I think we will together discuss, Chris, as you said, like, what can a kid realistically grasp, the reality and the consequences, and developmentally kids are not able to discern reality. But I'm super curious, and I know we'll talk about this later in the episode. What's the role of storytelling? What is the role of these many times very violent and not necessary dark fairy tales? So I'm just really curious about where we would go with that. And Joey, one of the things that I know was of interest to you when we're talking about the structure of the story is, what was the power structure between the various characters? Like, what was going on there? You did mention this story was in 1949. What was happening? It's like, well, all of the men had returned from the war if they were going to, or didn't. So there's also this timestamp. Why was the father not on the train? He is mentioned by the son, but he is not physically there with his family. But this older gentleman kind of ambles into an empty train. I was like, what do you think that was about, Joey?
I didn't really think about the dynamic. It just didn't really cross my mind because they're not in a relationship of any kind. It was just this very odd conversation in passing. But I mean, we can understand that this man who is older, who is well dressed, already has probably more influence and power than this single, well, she might not be single, but this lonely woman with her two kids on a train in ostensibly 1949, if not, sometime earlier a little bit. But that's a good point, that there is the male population of the country is coming back from war overseas, obviously from World War II. And so we can probably guess that if he's old enough to have white hair, I mean, some people go prematurely white. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think we're supposed to believe that he is an older gentleman, and so he probably didn't go to war, would be my assumption. I mean, there is this power dynamic that will inevitably happen because of his age and his gender, which would have given him more power. I mean, he obviously feels very comfortable having this weird conversation because he does it immediately. He doesn't hesitate. I'll pass off, but I do really want to talk about what you and Chris both were just talking about, how if this is a fairy tale, then what is the meaning of this tale? What if it's a parable, then what are we supposed to learn? And I think Chris has the answer, which is that we have this idea of the stereotypical idea of a witch, and you could probably, I mean, obviously we would have had Wizard of Oz by then. I think that came out in 1936. So a green witch with like a long nose, probably like a mole or whatever, a pointy hat. And then we have this man who could be a real witch. So if this is a parable or a fairy tale, then is the idea sort of what Nabokov was trying to teach us, which is that be careful of what's behind the scenes there. The facade might be nice, but there could be something sinister lying behind that.
Yeah, Joey, thank you for that, because that did pop into my mind before I pass over to Chris, that we start the story out with the young boy saying, I'm looking for witches. Like, he has engaged his imagination to kind of be searching the countryside. Because I remember when I read the story a few weeks ago, and I had a very different reaction to it reading it again today, that I toned down a tiny little bit. I think the first time I read it, I was like, what is wrong with this old man coming in here saying all this stuff to this kid? And I was like, well, this little boy already had this image of, I'm looking for witches, and I'm going to just be looking out the train window, because the older gentleman's like, so what are you looking at? What are you looking at out the window? And he's like, I'm looking for witches. And so the small boy opened this conversational gambit. So when you would ask originally, why is this called The Witch? I was like, well, there is the larger meaning, but like, who brought it up first? That little boy. Chris, do you want to talk to us about what you think the parable of this story is, or what the meaning of this fairy tale is? I love the fact that a man could be a witch. I love that idea.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think it really is to kind of shake the reader's reality or their perception of reality. Because again, point to Joey about, well, at that point in time in our culture and actually in previous literature, a witch was this old woman who was easy to spot. And it leads us to question, okay, is this person actually a witch, or is he playing with the child's own imagination? And so again, he could be a witch and he's actively engaging the child imagination and kind of expanding that. Or is this just a harmless old man who's still playing with this child's imagination? And obviously, this could have a future lifelong impact on this child's imagination. So then that calls into question, okay, if you're fiddling with somebody's imagination at that age and giving them a lifelong impact, does that by definition make you a witch? So I don't know. A lot of, I guess, different levels of interpretation there. So I guess that's what I took away from this.
Thanks for that, Chris. Joey, do you want to go back to that scene where they encounter each other and he's smoking a cigar? What are you looking out that window for? The man asked. Witches, the little boy said promptly. Bad old mean witches. I see, the man said. Find many? My father smoked cigars, the little boy said. All men smoke cigars, he said. Someday you'll smoke a cigar too. I'm a man already, the little boy said. And he's like, how old are you? The little boy, at the eternal question, looked at the man suspiciously for a minute and then said, 26, 848. And his mother lifted her head from the book and said, 4, she said, smiling fondly at the little boy. So at this point, all fun and games. I'm engaging in my fantasy land. But Joey, I think you saw a little bit of a different angle on what was really going on in that scene.
Yeah, it's hard for me to see this as a fairy tale. Like, I understand, I get where you're coming from, and I do understand that, where we have a moral lesson to learn, and maybe that's what this man was intending to do, was to imbue some morality on this little boy. Why he decided to do that when it's not his child and he was 4 years old. But anyway, that's not for me to judge. I see this as a story of how the patriarchy could be explained as or could be shown as a learned trait, as if this man is teaching this little boy who has no sense of patriarchal rule yet. Or maybe he does, but he's 4 years old, so I doubt it. As if this is a piece of information or knowledge that needs to be passed down from man to boy and so on throughout the generations in order to maintain patriarchy. So that's how I was seeing it when he's talking about, my father smokes cigars, all men smoke cigars. Someday you'll smoke a cigar too. So to me, this conversation was sort of coded a little bit. You can't, again, to the extent that you can have a nuanced conversation with a 4-year-old child, but to the reader, it felt like, to me at least, that was what the point was of this conversation, was to say that we have more power than women do. I mean, obviously it gets to be a ridiculous story. This man says he kills his sister at least twice and feeds her head to a bear, and it's just like, well, where'd you get the bear? It's just like, obviously this doesn't add up. So I see where that fantasy element comes into play, because obviously none of this is true. You can't kill someone twice unless you have the ability to resurrect as well. I guess maybe that's what it's trying to say, but it doesn't seem like it. But yeah, I think this is Shirley Jackson's way of sort of explaining patriarchy, and how if we can identify it, if we can say, okay, this is how it's passed down, is through conversations like this or through learned traits or mimicry from boys, from men, that we can end it. We can stop this toxic masculinity from being inherited by future generations. But maybe that's just me. Maybe.
Joey, I definitely can back you up on some of that. And then I'm just really curious about like Chris's experience as a man on this planet who had at one point a 4-year-old boy. And for me, what I thought was interesting when you said, wait, this story makes no sense. I'm like, yeah, that's the joy of telling a story to a 4-year-old. We can fly, we can go to the fair. I went to the moon. And I just recall my own experience as a 4-year-old girl having people tell me stories. I don't ever remember saying I wanted to murder my brother. I never dismembered anyone. No one ever encouraged me to say, oh, I'm going to chop your head off and feed it to a bear. Like, I don't remember having those conversations, but I certainly know Hansel and Gretel, right? They were going to their grandmother's house and like the Wicked Witch threw them in the oven and then baked them into gingerbread cookies and then ate them. I'm like, that is a screwed up story to tell a kid. I am sorry. And as we started thinking a little bit deeper about even modern day fairy tales that we tell through Disney, yes, it's a little bit sanitized, but like people die, the parents are missing, violence is ever present. And I think there has been conversations with us in the past of, is it important to tell kids the truth? Like we just talked about these stories in the past over the last few episodes about these utopian societies where they initiate children, between 8, 10, 12 years old as the realities of life. Is this what this story is doing? Like bad things happen to people. Is that part of what he's got going on? Or is this older gentleman just a little playful, but also a little unhinged? Because I just can't imagine, even in a playful jest, it's just not in me to be like, let's talk about dismembering your brother and feeding him to a wild animal. That is like such a fun story, isn't it? I'm like, no, it's not a fun story. And I don't know if that's sort of like female, male characteristic things that are just like, oh, I would say I would go to a tea party and I would say they bought some dresses and they probably rode in a carriage and they probably kissed a prince. Like those are stories that at 4 years old, I would definitely have been saying, but I probably wouldn't have had a violent end to that. So, Chris, I'm just super curious about, how did that strike you? How did that fairy tale element kind of work for you or not work for you?
Well, I can only reflect on my own interaction with my kids who are now grown. So, again, one daughter, one son. And I remember both of them being that age and really trying to foster a sense of creativity and fantastical thinking. I didn't necessarily want them to be so concrete in their thinking. So I really was kind of a proponent of some fantasy element when I'm reading stories to them or making up stories to them. Certainly, I wouldn't go into the level of graphic detail that this, obviously brings out. So I don't necessarily think, okay, this is geared towards that age group, but I really wanted to give them a sense of creativity that they hopefully could use throughout their life, no matter what they ended up doing, whether they're in the arts, writing, or if they're doing something like science research or being a mechanic. I wanted them to think, I guess, beyond the concrete. So in all honesty, I didn't necessarily see this type of a story, although, somewhat graphic. If I was this gentleman who met this 4-year-old child on the train, I might engage in the same type of a conversation with him and see if I could stretch his imagination. I know I've done that with kids with what I do in my profession on a day-to-day basis. I will sometimes speak to kids and then see if I can stretch their imagination. But again, I'm not going to be, going into such graphic detail as this if I'm doing that. But I would want to see if I can kind of get them to be comfortable and stretch their thinking.
So you think, and I'm just going to recap what I think I'm hearing from you, is that you have a little bit of empathy for this older gentleman, that he was like, obviously this kid is bored. He's looking out the window. He's engaging with him. He can see that the kid is a little precocious. It's like, you can call me Mr. Jesus. And the mom's like, Johnny, like, cut it. Like, seriously, like, you're not. And so the guy's like, how old is he? And the guy's like, oh, I'm 26. And he's like, you're 26, are you? How old's your sister? It's like 12 and a half. He's like, oh, really? And the mom's like, he's 4. And so it's just any suspension of disbelief about the power you have to shape what this kid is experiencing. He's 4 years old. You can visually see he's a kid. I have now, as the mother, confirmed this is my boy who's 4, who's just a little rambunctious. I do love the idea, and I also really enjoy kids, so like telling stories. But again, it would never occur to me to say what this man said, which it started out so innocently. He's like, do you love your sister? And the little boy's like, yes. And he's like, I loved my sister. I gave her lollipops and I bought her a pony and I did all of these things. And then I put my hands around her neck and strangled her until she was dead. And then I hit her with a stick and then I cut up her body and then she was dead again. And then I fed her to a bear. And I was like, what like that did not need to be part of the story. The little boy was not adding his own psychopath sort of energy to that. He was just really absorbing that. And I think where I got really upset at the story the first time I read it a couple of weeks ago, and I just really couldn't shake my anger at this gentleman. I was like, you are evil. Because at the end of the story, the little boy was like, oh, maybe we can kill mommy and take her head off too. It's like, pardon me? Like that is just, that's very interesting. But when I was challenged on that by someone else, but what are these Grimm's fairy tales? Like, what are the missing parents? Kids get killed all the time in these stories. Or if you're not getting killed, you're seconds away from disaster. Is our society perpetrating these negative and harmful, quote unquote, fairy tales that are like so educational to be more violent? Like, where's everybody had a tea party and kissed each other and read each other bedtime stories? Where's that? Where's that in the story? That's kind of missing. So, Joey, I'm super curious, like from a different generation than we are. And how do you remember? Like, you're the first person who told me the spoiler since I didn't see The Lion King. You're like, I gotta put some truth on you, Jennifer. Like, some people die. Like, you're gonna need to know that death happens.
In The Lion King?
Yeah.
I gave you a spoiler about that?
You did. We have it on tape. And I was like, oh.
Oh, I'm pretty sure it's
It's common knowledge, but
well,
I
yeah, but I'm
that.
pretty sure it's a retelling of Hamlet. So if you know that story, then you should. It feels like you.
You're like,
guess.
you can follow along. You can follow
Just
along.
insert lion. What I thought was interesting is that I think that the little boy does sort of show signs that he is engaging with this imaginary story, because he asks, the man says, and then I took her and I cut her head off and I took her head. Did you cut her on pieces? The little boy asked breathlessly. So he's obviously, I think he's engaged with the story to some extent. Whether he's breathless because he is caught up in the story or he's afraid of what this man is going to say. And he's just like, oh my God, I need to know. Like, I'm on the edge of my seat. I need to know if you cut your sister up. The little boy says something really interesting after the mother says, I can very easily call the conductor. And then the little boy says, the conductor will eat my mommy. We'll chop her head off. I'll just read what, instead of me pretending like I'm going to explain this better than what it's written. The conductor will eat my mommy, the little boy said. We'll chop her head off. And little sister's head too, the man said. He stood up and the mother stood back to let him get out of the seat. Don't ever come back in this car, she said. My mommy will eat you, the little boy said to the man. And so I really love that one little line where the little boy breaks from this and says, like, sir, if I have to choose the most powerful person in this train car, it's my mother, and she's going to mess you up if you don't get away from me. Like, this woman is serious. He obviously respects his mother to such an extent that he's like, oh, no, no, no. I'm done with this little imaginary fairy tale, but my mom's gonna mess you up, sir, if you don't get away from me. Like, it was fun playing all these games, but at the end of the day, my mom is here
She's serious.
to protect me. Yeah,
she is serious. And Joey, I love what they said immediately after that, because the man laughed and the little boy laughed, and then the man said, excuse me, to the mother, and went past her out of the car. When the door had closed behind him, the little boy said, how much longer do we have to stay on this old train? Right. And that's where he started the story with his mom. It's like, how much longer do we have to do this? And when I think back, Joey, if this is like a bigger story of the patriarchy, of learned behaviors, of how the world works, like this is a lesson in like how things go, how much longer do we need to be on this train? Because I don't like it, but I do love that he's like, I'm going to call in a higher authority, which is my mother, and you do not want to mess with her, because just trust me on that. And it was interesting though, Joey, I want to take you just a moment before that, because I was like, what's this old man's deal? Because he said, ate her head all up, the little boy asked. The mother put her book down and came across the aisle. She stood next to the man and said, just what do you think you're doing? The man looked up courteously and she said, get out of here. Did I frighten you? The man said. He looked down at the little boy and nudged him with an elbow, and he and the little boy laughed. I'm like, what was that? He's like, haha, look, I made your mom scared. And I was like, not funny. Like, mom is not going to have that. And I just thought, thank you, Shirley Jackson. Like, what an interesting thing to show that this gentleman can be like, I didn't scare you, did I? Like, I don't know if you've ever been alone on a train in a car with a person who could physically overpower you or is saying really inappropriate things to your kid and be like, oh, you're not scared of me, are you? I'm like, well, a little. just a teeny little bit. And the fact that you called out that you might be scaring me and laughed about it, something's a little icky about that moment. Chris, what was your reaction to that unfolding?
So it's an interesting point that you brought up regarding that one circumstance. And yeah, it really kind of reminded me that someone that age can certainly be persuaded to either side. And so it's almost like, okay, he's in on the joke, so to speak, with the old man. And all of a sudden now he's in cahoots with him. And it's like, oh, look, we're getting mom all riled up. Hey, let's work together. Yeah. And so it's a creepy element, to be honest with you, because now all of a sudden you're persuading such a young, malleable mind to now go against your own family. Someone who's obviously, now he's 4 years old and, very, very young, but it's like, okay, someone who's been caring for him, now all of a sudden, well, they can be turned against them. So yeah, it's actually a very scary element.
Yeah, and Chris, I just want to stop you right there because what popped up for me and saying that, it's this us against them feeling. It was the man with the boy against the mom and the daughter and his baby sister that the old man said that he had killed. So I'm like, excuse me, they weren't killing the dad, they weren't killing the conductor, they weren't doing these other things. I was like, how interesting. And I think little kids do like to have the like, ooh, we have a secret, like we're doing something different against our parents without the, as you said, the concrete knowledge of knowing it's like, did we just talk about murder in a story as like a fun thing to do, or like this would be like a good idea? So I'm sure you have more to say about that, but that dynamic of us against them, this just came after the war, like who's a good guy, who's a bad guy, who can you trust, who's going to rescue you when things get hard. The kid's like, my mom is going to handle stuff. So like whatever you think is going on here, sir, I would just do what she says. And I remember when I was a young girl, my brother's 4.5 years younger than me, and somebody was at our house and they said, oh, I don't know how to do that. And he goes, ask my mom. She knows everything, right? So my brother at that age, the smartest person in the absolute world is my mom. She knows everything. I'm like, yeah, when you're 4, it's really, really easy to know more than the average 4-year-old. So yeah, just thinking that was worth saying. And Chris, did you have something more that you wanted to add to that, or do we want to pivot to a new point?
No, I was just going to basically expound on that and say that it really kind of emphasizes the fact that when you're that young, like I remember my own upbringing, times where I was so angry at like my parents that I would say really, kind of crazy things like, I'm going to run away, or I'm going to I'm going to kill you, and it's like, okay, well, yeah, you don't really mean that when you're that young and you don't really get the sense of permanency. So it's easy to not realize what you're saying at that time. You just don't have a full sense of connection or reality at that age. And yet you still have some elements of memory. I remember, again, fragments of my childhood that were really kind of, when you think about it, it just didn't make sense at all at the time. And it's like, what I'm remembering is like, okay, what was I thinking? So that's all I wanted to add to that.
Thank you for that. Joey, anything else that you would like to explore on that or pivot to another topic?
I'm going to do both. I want to add to what Chris was just saying, and it's sort of hard to keep in mind as we're adult readers, obviously we're all adults, that to a 4-year-old, they have yet to contemplate mortality, their own mortality, or anybody else's mortality for that matter. Maybe they had a pet that died, but he's not seeing the repercussions of what this conversation is like. He probably understands what the word die means, or dead, or kill, but does he understand the repercussions of that? That's a forever change in this person's life, or the end of their life, I should say. I think that's an important aspect to remember, so thank you, Chris, for bringing that up. It's sort of like reading something anachronistically, where we're not keeping that in mind, what is going through this child's head. I don't remember being 4 years old. I don't have a 4-year-old. So I have cousins who were 4 years old, but I definitely didn't talk to them like this. I made up funny scenarios for them, but not like that. So with that in mind, I do want to say that I think that what is so unsettling, or to me at least, is how this man uses language in such an insidious way, because he obviously knows, probably most people innately know, even if you're not around children. I'm not around children all the time. I know how to talk to a child. I usually talk to them like they're adults, not inappropriate topics like this, but I won't baby talk a child. I'll just talk to them like I'm talking to you. But he has sort of breathless is a good term. So it's funny that that's in the story where a kid almost cannot get their mouth to keep up with their brain, with their imagination. And they're like, oh my God. And then, and then, and then, and then. And that's what this man is doing. And I'll just read a little bit of that. Now he's talking about his sister. I bought her a rocking horse and a doll and a million lollipops, the man said. And then I took her and put my hands around her neck and I pinched her and I pinched her until she was dead. It's just like, and then a little bit later, he said, I cut off her head and her hands and her feet and her hair and her nose, the man said, and I hit her with a stick and I killed her. So now he's killed her twice. But and then kind of thing, like where he just can't get it out fast enough. This story that he's now telling to himself in his mind, he cannot bring it out into reality quite as fast. So to me, that's a disturbing part, is that this man usually, again, like it depends, I guess, on the adult and the child that you're talking to and the relationship you have with them. But it almost like we will sort of dumb down what we're saying, but we're not going to tell the story the same exact way as a child, because we're not a child. We can articulate ourselves in different ways, and we know how to simplify that for the audience that's in front of us.
Yeah, Joey, can I just follow up one quick thing before you carry on? Just when you said that about the storytelling style in which the man is adding these details and then, and another thing, and another thing, and then, oh my gosh, I'm going to tell you something even more fantastic. You tapped into some empathy I didn't know I had for this older man. Maybe he's recounting being a 4-year-old boy and getting swept up in story and not thinking, oh, I'm being horrific and telling this kid about dismembering a person. I'm just playing the game of imagination. I just got swept up and like, oh, and another thing. And then this thing happened. And then I rode a pony and then I did this and like this whole just getting swept up. And so, Joey, thank you for softening me a little bit by giving me perhaps
I didn't mean to do that.
Yeah, you're like, no, wrong, incorrect. But
wrong way.
Wrong, horrible. Don't do this to children.
Yeah.
But I can just in that moment, as you said that, I was like, maybe this Shirley Jackson is telling us that anyone can kind of get swept up in this imagination cyclone, right? And it is up to you as a grown-up who knows the consequences of words, right? Words are powerful, use them wisely, that you just wouldn't do this with a kid. So thank you for just giving me that little brief moment. And I'd love to hear where you were going with that. Although I'm totally wrong. I got that, Joey.
No, you can have that opinion. I don't see it. I don't agree, but that's okay. That's what makes dynamic conversations.
You said the phrase insidious language, and I thought that was like a very evocative phrase. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what you mean by that?
I just mean that he's smart enough to understand. He's trying to communicate a very specific message, and he knows exactly how to deliver that so that the message is received and understood by this child. If he explained in a very gruesome but articulate way that he would explain to an adult how he dismembered his sister as a child and fed her head to a bear, if he had such a thing, okay, he's not going to use language like this. He would say it in a matter-of-fact way, probably, if he's a psychopath. I mean, I'm thinking of like the BTK killer, and if anybody has ever seen like his, no, okay. Never mind. Anyway, real person, BTK killer, okay. He very matter-of-factly in court explained his crimes and how he did all of those things. But anyway, that's not really what I was talking about, because this man is very emotional. But that's what disturbed me the most, I think, in this story, other than the actual material or what he's saying, is that he is aware that he is trying to convince this little boy that this is what he did. And it also makes me think, and I know it's sort of psychological analysis of characters is sort of not the thing to do in literature, but I don't care. I will do it anyway. To me, this seems like maybe there is some type of cognitive issue that is going on with this man to think that this type of story is totally appropriate. Maybe I'm being a little too judgy. I don't want to say I'm judging, because I'm not judging anybody that has any type of cognitive issues or anything like that, or is neurodivergent. That's not my point. It seems like there is some type of missing element that he doesn't understand. You don't talk to children about this type of thing. A fantastical story, sure. Maybe talk about your pet bear. but don't talk about this.
Thank you for saying that, Joey, because I wanted to go back to the very, very end of the story because I thought that was such a reality check, right? If we're dealing with a lot of non-reality, this was an interesting reality check. So the little boy had asked the mom, "How much longer do we have to stay on this old train?" "Not much longer," the mother said. She stood looking at the little boy, wanting to say something, and finally she said, "You sit still and be a good boy. You may have another lollipop." The boy climbed down eagerly and followed his mother back to her seat. So again, now they're joined. He's close. He's in his mother's realm now, right? He's getting closer. And she took a lollipop from a bag in her pocketbook and gave it to him. "What do you say?" she asked. "Thank you," the little boy said. "Did that man really cut his little sister up in pieces?" "He was just teasing," the mother said, and added urgently, "just teasing." "Probably," the little boy said. With his lollipop, he went back to his own seat and settled himself to look out the window again. Probably he was a witch. And I just love that he was like, okay, he didn't really kill anybody, but I'm still in this fantasy world. And, men can be witches. Why not? Witches do bad things. He did bad things, even if he was just pretending. So I just really love that Shirley Jackson cements this into there that the mom's like, I need to say something to my kid, but I don't know what to say. Like, how do you say that was all pretend without the kid getting, it's like, well, what does pretend mean? It's like, can you discern as a child what your imaginary friend did versus what you actually can experience in real life? So I just thought that was really well done on Shirley Jackson's part of let the kids still have the last word of like, yeah, I think he was a witch. And Chris, where did that land with you? Was that ending satisfying for you, or are you still contemplating that?
So the ending, to be honest with you, you could almost picture that as you can picture that on the screen, actually happening. Like if someone was to make this into like a short video or something like that, it's kind of this little bit of a cliffhanger ending where the viewer is saying, maybe was it a witch? Was it not a witch? I don't know. It also, I think, leads to a larger question of, again, questioning reality versus fantasy, not as a child, but also as an adult. You wonder, okay, was this made up? Was this whole interaction, was it real or was it not? Was this gentleman actually confessing something and being fantastical about it? Like Joey was saying, okay, yeah, he just kind of kept going and going and going and just kind of wrapped up and everything. But did he actually do something in real life? And was he actually confessing? But he was confessing in a veiled way. So again, it leaves this larger looming question that is unanswered. I also read into this something maybe a little bit different, was especially that one line that you said, how much longer do we have to stay on this old train? It left me thinking, okay, is the entire train ride a little bit of a metaphor for your life's course? And you're on this one track and your mother is with you there, and she's there along with you. And this child kind of innocently asks, well, maybe I don't like the way that this course is going. How much longer do we have to stay on this track? Can we change to a different track? I'm probably reading way too much into this when I'm looking at this, but it leaves me thinking, okay, is this meaning something else? And I have to look at it from the perspective of Shirley Jackson and her own personal experiences. Her life doesn't sound like it really kind of went the way she wanted it to go. So is this something like a little bit of an allegory where it's like, okay, can you change the direction if you don't like where you're going? So I don't know. Like I said, my mind was kind of wandering a little bit, and maybe I'm way far off and just kind of on a tangent. But that's, again, what I was thinking regarding that.
Yeah, Chris, thanks for sharing that, because what came up for me when you were talking about they are on this track, meaning Joey and I, discussed the lottery, and we've discussed several stories recently about female writers creating an alternate reality of how society works and what the rules are. And so when I'm thinking about what this little boy is being modeled by this man, because he's like, do you love your sister? And he's like, yes. The little boy's like, yeah, I love my sister. And before the man comes on the train, the little girl, she slipped in her seat and she started to cry. So the little 4-year-old boy, Johnny, goes over and he's trying to comfort his sister, right? He's like, don't cry, don't cry. He's being very loving and very kind. kind and not like, ha ha, you bumped your head. Like he's not being like an evil little psychopath. He's being a very compassionate, like, don't cry, sister. So when this old man says, oh, I loved my sister and she was really pretty, and then I killed her. And so for me, that was that underlying patriarchy thing of like, you know what? If you want to kill somebody, go right ahead. And if it's a woman and it's somebody you love, we can do that because that's how this whole thing is set up. And so I'm just curious in reflecting on this sort of arc of stories we've read about like what might be some societal rules. Many of these stories we've read recently are like, if you don't like the world you're in, change it. And I think that was part of what Shirley Jackson was saying. To your point, Chris, it's like, do you want to stay on this train or do you want to get off? Because like where this is heading, we're going to get to 2025 sooner than you think. So let's switch stations because I think it's time to get off that train and try something else. So yeah, very interesting.
I just want to add, I think, Chris, you solved a riddle for me of this story because I could not figure out why the little boy calls himself Mr. Jesus. Because I'm like, I don't think Shirley Jackson was religious, or at least I don't recall that in any of her bio stuff that I've read. That doesn't mean it's not a thing. I just could not remember it. And that's totally fine. But I couldn't figure out like what was the purpose. There's no real biblical images coming up in this story except for this random Mr. Jesus part. It just doesn't make any sense to me. But Chris, you were saying like, is this older man confessing the guilt to a real crime? Did he actually kill his sister? Not in this way. I doubt he fed her to a bear. But if that is the case, and this is his confession, is he trying to absolve himself of guilt from this crime through the innocence of this child who now referred to himself as Mr. Jesus, you know? Or is this a signal that if there was an extension to this story that Johnny would have to die because he would have to die for this old man's sin? So I think, I don't know, maybe you cracked the code there, Chris. That's the only thing that makes sense to me now that I've been thinking about it. Like, what the hell? Why is this in here? It's there for a reason. She didn't write it just because she was like, I don't know, name him Mr. Jesus. Like, she could have named him Mr. Potato Head. It could have been anything, but she specifically used that name. So that's what I think.
Awesome. Thank you for saying that, Joey, because one of the, like, when we think about other writers of this time, Flannery O'Connor was peddling her trade and her short stories, economical, graphic violence, children in inappropriate situations, and a very clear religious overtone to it. And I don't think, in my experience, the brief amount that I've read about Shirley Jackson, I didn't get an overwhelming sense of a organized religious theme as we have seen in Flannery O'Connor, both in her private writings and what she has said about her works. So I just think that is very interesting. It's like, what was that about? And I'm always curious, and I know we're going to wrap up here soon, that I'm always curious of what writers influenced other writers. Was Shirley Jackson reading Flannery O'Connor and vice versa? Like, what was that conversational channel? Were they totally separate? Were they rivals? Were they compatriots? They both died young. They both had ill health. They were writers who had an opportunity to be at university and kind of get access to people who could publish their stories. It's just very, very interesting if their paths ever crossed. And if they did, would they like each other? Would they hate each other? Flannery O'Connor, as we have talked about previously, was very free with her criticism and condemnation of other writers who were talented and successful. Would that have been like, yay, girls team, look at us, like we're doing great things? Or it's just like, no, back it off, lady.
The Spice Girls weren't around yet. There was no girl power yet.
I didn't think as like, ladies, and like, nope, every person for themselves. Thank you both for indulging my imagination of they both were hanging out in New York in 1962 or something. Like, what if they bumped into each other in New York and sat on the subway? Because Joey, we know that story where she sat on the subway when she was in New York and she was like, whoa, like New York is not a place for me, said
Flannery O'Connor.
Yeah. So I'm like, well, what if they did bump into each other, like mysteriously? Like, that's a story
I imagine that Flannery O'Connor would look at Shirley Jackson and be like, ew, what a hot mess.
Yeah, it's like oh, are you really going to eat that? Yeah.
It seems like Shirley Jackson was just like, I'm not wearing a bra. I don't care about brushing my hair. I mean, I don't know. Yeah,
as I don't know. In The Misfit, right? When you travel, you're supposed to look like a proper Southern lady. And it's like Shirley Jackson, from what we know about her, is like, I am not conforming to these standards because this is not my jam. I am not interested in that. So what I would love to do, Joey, and I know we cannot manifest this, but I would love this to happen. Maybe one of our listeners will do this. I would love to have George Saunders, perhaps. George Saunders, can you write this story for me, please? I would love to have an imagined conversation between Shirley Jackson and Flannery O'Connor. They bump into somewhere and they're like watching a scene unfold. And they both are like giving their commentary of what's going on here. Because as we heard in The Misfit, we celebrate evil. Like evil exists, and Flannery O'Connor does not blink. She was like, that, my friend, is the devil. Like that person is really straight up evil. And I don't think Shirley Jackson put such a fine point on it, but she's like, something is not right here. And I want you as the reader to figure out what that is. So
you don't need George Saunders. You can do it yourself, Jennifer. You have the ability.
I might, but I have to go to Syracuse University where all these amazing talents are like circling around apparently. But yeah, it's just
you don't want to go there.
I don't want to, I might not want to go there, but I do want to say thank you, Chris, for joining us. And thank you, Joey, for being always a fun conversational partner who always pushes me to see things in a much different way. And I think as we have been on this journey for 6-8 months now, quite some time, I think the quality of my ability to read a story and consider other perspectives has really grown as a result of our conversation. So I'm just feeling really grateful about that. And anything you'd like to add, Chris, before we wrap up? And Joe?
No, not really. I just really wanted to thank you so much for the invitation. This has really been a great experience for, like I said, my first time being on a podcast. So thank you so much. Hopefully I've provided some type of insight.
Thanks for that, Chris. And as we are Extra Literary Affairs, we love to have affairs with new people and bring them into the fold of amazing writers. So thank you so much for that. Enjoy anything in closing?
No.
Awesome.
Thank you for listening to the Extra Literary Affairs podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's discussion. And don't worry, it'll be our little secret you stepped out of your literary comfort zone. Check out our link tree to follow us on TikTok, YouTube, Blue Sky, and Storygraph.